non-Penfield area, and our speaker today is our town historian, Kathy Kanauer. And we're going to have her speak for a while, and then we have another gentleman by the name of Don Nasky, and he's going to come up and do some talk also on this history of Civil War. Next year, we're going to have several different lectures on different things pertaining to the Civil War. We're putting that all together, and we'll get that information out as soon as we can to our members, and it will be in the paper, so anybody that's not a member picks up on it. Please come and join us. We're always welcome new faces, new friends. So without any further ado, I think that's all I have. I'm just going to let Kathy come up here and take over. She's all set up. She's all dressed up.
Thanks, Charlie. Well, I was supposed to be in costume today, but it takes a lot longer to make a Civil War outfit than it does to make a current day outfit. I think it might be done for something next year, but it's not done for this one. Okay, I don't know if some of you were here last month. This is, okay, I deal a lot better with historic things than technical things. So if you were here last month, some of this is a little repetitive because I want to go over the statistics again on the soldiers from Penfield. And before we get started, this is a picture of Penfield Road standing east of the Four Corners and looking west. The building on that side with the pillars is the Mexican restaurant from today. This is around the turn of the century, kind of how Penfield looked during the Civil War. We don't actually have photographs of the town from that time, so this is one of the earliest ones I could find. The exact number of soldiers that served from Penfield is difficult to determine. Lists of names vary from source to source. Most men re-enlisted in a regiment, served out their time, and then were discharged when their time was over. Some of them re-enlisted in other regiments. Some deserted and re-enlisted under a different name to get the enlistment bounty. After the draft began, some hired substitutes to take their place. Some of the substitutes were local men, and some of them came from other states and also Canada. Men were moved around within a regiment, and sometimes they joined units together when the numbers started to decrease because of soldiers being killed or wounded and taken out of the battle. So that also causes confusion. For these reasons, an accurate list cannot be compiled. The exact number of men who served from Penfield is unknown, but falls in the range of 290 to 370. The town clerk records list contains 236 names, but not all the Penfield soldiers enlisted here. So there are other soldiers on somebody else's town clerk's list. And I also like to count the soldiers that moved here after the Civil War. They might not have lived here, enlisted from here or anything else, but if they were here, we claim them. Figures in this range are equal to about 10% of the population of the town, or about 20% of the total male population, and that's roughly the same percentage of males that served the Union from New York State as a whole. Enthusiasm for the Union cause ran strong. The first soldier that I want to talk about from Penfield is named Daniel Lapins. He was born in Penfield in 1846 to John and Nancy Lapins. In 1855, the family boarded with Polly Gifford on the west side of 5 Mile Line, north of the Four Corners. Daniel enlisted in Company E of the 108th New York Infantry as a private on July 20th, 1862. In a letter from Daniel to Tide Church, who was keeping track of the soldiers from town, he was a local resident. And this letter was dated May 16th, 1895. Daniel said he was 16 years and 3 months of age, but he enlisted as 18. When he was mustered into service August 16th, 1862. He was with the regiment at Antietam, and then he was detached from the regiment on September 20th, when they were at Harper's Ferry to serve on Professor Lowe's Balloon Corps. And this is a drawing from the time of the Balloon Corps. And what they did is serve as spies. Now, they weren't, you know how balloons can be. They weren't like satellites or anything, but they were out of the range for the most part of the guns and the weapons that they had at the time. I have a couple more balloon pictures in here. This is an actual photograph of a balloon. See, it's tethered. It's kind of out the top of the picture, and they're all looking up at it. And then this is Lowe's balloon. It was mostly one man, Professor Lowe, who supervised all of the balloons, spy balloons. And this is the gas generator. It's pictured in Washington, D.C. with the Capitol building in the back that would have fired up the balloons. So anyway, getting back to Mr. Lapins, he served with that balloon corps. I don't know exactly what he did. He didn't say that in his letter, but he served with them until the regiment started for Fredericksburg, October 26th, and then he joined the regiment at Aquila Creek. He was with the regiment from that time on in the battles of Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg. He was struck by a piece of shell about 4 p.m. on July 3rd at Gettysburg, causing severe contusion of his hip and spine. And he was sent to Market Street Hospital, New Jersey, and then he was transferred by General Order number 296 of the War Department to the 17th Volunteer Reserve Corps. Apparently he wasn't fit to go back into active duty. He re-enlisted in Trenton, New Jersey on September 6, 1864 in Company A of the 21st Regiment of the Volunteer Reserve Corps, and then he was credited to the state of New Jersey. And you can see this is one example of why things are confusing, because I'm sure New Jersey claims him as well. His length of service, his total length of service was 3 years and 4 months. He says on the 4th day of July, 1866, by the legislature of New Jersey, I received an award of honorable testimonial signed by the governor, Marcus L. Ward. I tried to look up and find out what an award of honorable testimonial was exactly, but I couldn't find anything about it. But it was something local, or at least in the state they were doing. He said, I have 2 sons. Joseph is attending Bucknell University at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, and he graduates next year. He's 19 and he's preparing for the ministry. The other son, John, is attending the high school here, and he's age 16. Our daughter, Miss Addie, age 21, is a home missionary teaching at Spelman Seminary in Atlanta, Georgia. Like many of the old boys, especially the comrades, I'm getting quite bald and gray. My health has been quite poor for the past year, and especially so for the past 2 months. I enlisted in 1872 under a new commander, the Lord Jesus Christ, whom I have tried to serve to the best of my ability ever since. Sometime I expect to meet him personally with many other friends, and it's signed by the Reverend Daniel P. Lapins, Brookfield, Madison, New York. The next soldiers I want to talk about, the more I researched these 3, the more confused I became. This is the Peck family. And if you look at the official roster of the 108th New York Infantry, there are 3 Peck boys listed on that roster. There's Elwood Peck. It said he was age 21 when he enlisted April 27, 1863 at Rochester to serve 3 years as a private in Company B. It said he was arrested in Buffalo later as a deserter and returned to the regiment, and then no dates on that and no further record. Then there's Willard H. Peck. His age was given as 18 when he enlisted, July 18, 1862 at Rochester to serve 3 years, mustered in as a private in Company A. He was captured by guerrillas about June 11, 1863 near Stafford Courthouse, Virginia, and no further record according to the 108th roster, but I have more information on him. And then William E. Peck. It said age 18. He enlisted at Rochester to serve 3 years and mustered in as a corporal, Company A, July 19, 1862. He was killed by guerrillas about June 11, 1863 near Stafford Courthouse, Virginia. While the town clerk's records list only William H. and Elwood W. in the index of names, and then when you follow the index and go back to the page, the entries are Elwood W. and Willard H. So she's confused the name. I think having William and Willard is a little bit confusing, and the father's name was William. But in her list, there's no there's no listing for William E. signing up. I mention this because I think it's probable and possible that there were just 2 Peck boys. I don't know how the 108th got confused about how many soldiers they had, but I think when I looked at the census before, there was William and there was Willard. It's William E. and Willard H. William E. could be the same person as Elwood W. I think they could have just gotten the middle name and first name reversed. And they might have called him Elwood at times because the father's name is William. I couldn't find Elwood listed in any census before or after the Civil War. So that's one of the things that tell me maybe there was only 2. Maybe not, you know, I might have been led in the wrong direction, but that's what I tend to think. We know that Willard, we know information about Willard, and he sent a memoir to the history of the 108th, or to whoever was collecting information for the 108th. This picture in the 108th, in the history of that regiment, is listed as William or Elwood, or William Elwood, or Elwood William, was killed. And I think this is an older man, so I think this is a picture of Willard in his older years, or middle-aged years, and they got it wrong. They have it labeled wrong. But anyway, this is one of the Pecks, William or Willard, that we're looking at. Willard was born in Clarkson, New York on February 13, 1847, to William and Charlotte Peck. By 1860, the family resided in the town of Penfield. William was the minister at the East Penfield Free Will Baptist Church. Children in the home in 1860 in the census were Orpha Marie, William Edward, that's how the census had him listed, and Willard 14. Census takers aren't always correct. I'm still thinking he could be Elwood. Prior to enlisting, Willard was a student in the common schools of the day and then in the academies at both Penfield and Macedon. He enlisted in the 108th. He gave his age as 18, but he was actually only 15 when he enlisted. In his account, he describes that he served with the unit until June 11, 1863. While on march from Falmouth, Virginia to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and while the soldiers were resting and eating their dinner near Stafford Courthouse, Virginia, he and his brother William, of the same regiment, went to a spring nearby to get some water. While they were there, they were taken prisoner by guerrillas, and they were marched about 1.5 miles away from their unit. They were shot down in cold blood. William was killed instantly, and Willard received a severe wound to the head, from which he remained unconscious for about 24 hours. When he had somewhat recovered, he was wandering around in the woods, and he was found by 2 young ladies that happened to be passing by, and he was taken with them to their father's house, where a ball and 5 buckshots were removed. This was the only picture. I was trying to figure out or find the exact size of these so I could tell you, they're as big as a dime or a nickel or whatever. I couldn't find that. But even if, no matter how small they are, if you had one of the large ones and 3 of the small ones removed, it seems to me like that's a lot of stuff to have in your head that doesn't belong there. He was shot on the right side of his head. The ball and shots were embedded in his head, the hair being pressed under. By the use of shears, the hair was cut from the scalp, and then by prying and prying, the ball and shots were removed. He remained with the citizens in that community until the return of the army from Gettysburg several weeks thereafter. He reported to his regiment, but he was unable to perform his duties. He was sent home and placed under the care of Dr. Backus, post surgeon at Rochester, New York, and was an inmate of St. Mary's Hospital for some time. From that day until the close of the war, he remained at home with his parents in Penfield and made occasional visits to Dr. Backus at Rochester, requesting and expecting to be sent back to his regiment. But in that he was disappointed. The doctor didn't consider him able to do duty on account of that wound. He remained with his parents until the summer of 1861, when he entered as a student the law office of Butler and McDowell of Cohocton, where he remained 1 year. He then spent 1 year with lawyer Spooner of Avoca and finished his law course in the office of Vanderlip and Smith in Dansville. By 1870, he'd married a woman named Alice, and they had 1 child, a son named William Elwood. who was living in Canisius. That's why people have trouble doing genealogy sometimes too, because they keep repeating the same name generation after generation. In the year 1872, he enlisted in the ministry of the Free Baptist denomination, and he was ordained September 4th, 1874. He served in Italy, Naples, Shelby Center, and Wheatville, New York, and then for the next 3 years, Tioga City, Pennsylvania, and then he was back in New York in Tuscarora and West Valley. Willard had personal acquaintance with different governmental departments in Washington, D.C., and he was able to assist many of his old comrades in getting their pensions, because remember, he had that law background. He'd studied with several different lawyers. I couldn't find Willard and his family in the census after 1870, so I don't know where he's buried exactly. And there's one more bit of confusion surrounding the Pecks, of course. Little Nellie wrote an article for her paper, the Penfield Extra, that ran on February 4th, 1864. And in it, she heads the article up, Surgical Operation. Willie Peck, which really could be William or Willard. Willie Peck, a son of Reverend Mr. Peck of this town, was shot in the head last June while in the service by guerrillas, and after being transferred from hospital to hospital, was finally permitted to come home on an invalid's furlough. He called on Dr. Burroughs last week, and after considerable investigation, it was ascertained that a bullet was lodged under the scalp and next to the bone, embedded in a firm sac at a distance of several inches from the point of entrance. The scalp and sac were laid open by the doctor and the ball removed, which was found to be completely flattened. The young man is doing well. His brother, who was with him at the same time, was instantly killed by a shot through the brain. The reason this is confusing is because I wonder if he didn't get shot twice, because unless she was confused on the information she got, it sounded like the bullet and the buckshot was removed before he ever came home. But her report is that he came home and the doctor here removed it, so it sounds like he was a very lucky man, even if we can't figure out the rest of his family. And that's the picture again. I think it's Willard. And this man is Bernard Mathers. I will read you his account is written for the Memoirs of the 108th Infantry in October 1890. I was born in 1846, lived and was raised on a farm in the town of Penfield, Monroe County, New York. Went to school till the age of 16 when I enlisted as a private in Company A of the 108th Regiment, New York Volunteers. Left for the seat of war with the regiment on the 19th day of August, 1862. I was in the battles of Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg, where I was wounded and my right leg was amputated below the knee, which occurred on the 3rd day of July 1863. I was carried from the field by Timothy Keefe, who was a member of Company K. Otherwise, I would not have been alive today. I remained in the battlefield hospital for some time when I was moved to Baltimore, Maryland, remained there until the spring of 1864, when I was sent to David's Island, New York, and from there was transferred to Central Park Hospital, New York City, and in November of 1864, received my discharge. I then returned to Rochester, New York, where I learned to make artificial limbs. I worked in Rochester till April of 1865 when I moved to New York City. In the fall of 1866, I moved to Macon, Georgia, and went to making legs for the ex-Confederates. Remained there till the spring of 1867 when I moved to Charleston, South Carolina. Worked there till the spring of 1868 when I came up north and located in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I was married in 1870, and then in 1872 moved to Louisville, Kentucky, and started in business for myself. Have remained there ever since and located on the corner of 4th Avenue and Market Street. I think it's interesting. He was an amputee, and then he went into making artificial limbs. And I was trying to find a picture of some artificial limbs, which I really couldn't, but I thought it was interesting. What I did find, there was an ad in the paper from the time. If you needed an artificial limb, I guess you didn't have to go through your doctor. Maybe you just contacted them. You know, today we'd go through the doctor to be fitted and everything, but it sounds like you just answer the ad in the newspaper and they'd make you whatever you needed. Bernard's pension records list that he was born in Switzerland, was 5 foot 4 inches tall with a light complexion, blue eyes, and light hair. And so another interesting story, just because of how his life followed up after the war, according to what happened to him in the war. And the other thing I was thinking about, it sounded like he was moving every year for a while. He probably made the artificial limbs in a certain area for as many as were needed, and then they were finished, and so he moved on to a new area. So it's all very interesting how it fits together. I'm going to talk now about several soldiers from Penfield that were in the 8th New York Cavalry, and I don't have their photographs of them, so I included a photograph of the 8th monument that's at Gettysburg. The first one I want to talk about is DeWitt Clinton Hammond. He and his family lived on the south side of Hermance Road in northeast Penfield. When he enlisted as a private in the 8th Cavalry on August 22nd, 1862, he was 42 years old. He left his wife, Pamelia, and 6 children, Abby, 14, Nathan, 11, Dwayne, 10, Mary, 8, Delia, 6, and William, 4. In the 1850 census, D.C. Hammond's occupation is listed as a mason, but then in 1855 he was listed as a farmer, so I think he might have dabbled in both of them. In a series of letters dated November 30th, 1862 through June 26, 1864, written from DeWitt to his wife Pamelia, one of the main themes is lack of money. He writes in most of the letters about sending some money home when they get paid. They never seemed to get paid. It seemed like they would move on and the mail never caught up with them. He doesn't know when it's going to be. He encourages his wife to keep the children at home with her, not putting them out to work, which was something that was done when they were short of money. You hire them out to a local farmer, or the girls could be hired out to be kitchen help or help around the house. He writes concerns for the children's health and encourages them to be good for their mother. Well, son Dwayne, who was the 110 that I mentioned in that one in the census, he had an accident. Dwayne was asked, and this I found in Little Nellie's paper. He was asked to hold the reins of a horse that were pulling a piece of farm equipment. It was either a plow or some kind of a harvester. And he didn't exactly just hold the reins. I think he got a little ambitious and he swatted the horse, so that's what Little Nellie said. And they took off, and this piece of equipment ran over his foot and cut it off. So here's his father, DeWitt. Now he's not having to just worry about sending money home. He's having to worry about this son who's lost his foot or the bottom of his leg. And he wrote in one of the letters, "When I get home, we'll get Dwayne an artificial leg." Well, that never happened. D.C.'s health suffered during the time. He was sick and he was sent to a hospital, and he helped take care of the other patients there. And also at that time, D.C. and several others were given the job of butchering cows, which were used to feed the soldiers. But he never regained his health. He died of what they just called fever at the Regimental Hospital near Strasburg, Virginia, on November 4th, 1864, and he was buried in Winchester National Cemetery. So I don't know if Dwayne ever got his artificial leg, because Little Nellie didn't write any more about him, and his father's letters obviously stopped at that time. Another Penfield soldier that was in the 8th Cavalry was Abel Franklin Case. He was born in Penfield, and he was also 42 years old in August of 1862 when he enlisted as a private in Company A of the 8th New York. He left his wife, Aseneth, and children, Hobart, 14, Rhoda, Ophelia, 8, and Myron, 6, to serve the Union cause. Prior to enlisting, he worked for the Gifford and Case Nursery, which is located in the area of where today Peachtree Street is, along Penfield Road. The Case family lived on the north side of Penfield Road, just west of Baird, and they were members of the Penfield Baptist Church. In October of 1863, Abel was promoted to sergeant. He was captured by the rebels at the Battle of Stony Creek Station, Virginia, on June 29, 1864. He was sent to Andersonville Prison in Georgia, where he died of scurvy on September 11th, 1864, and he was buried at Andersonville. But there is a marker that was placed in his memory at the family plot in Oakwood, so if you walk over to Oakwood and wander around, you'll find it looks like his grave is there, but he's not there. And a third soldier, there were many more, I just picked 3 of them out, but a third soldier that served in the 8th Cavalry from Penfield was Edward P. Follett. He was also captured at that Battle of Stony Creek, and he was born in Penfield. He was 22 when he enlisted, and he was a bugler in Company A. He'd come from a family of 7 or 8 children, and they lived on the west side of 5 Mile Line south of the Four Corners. His father, Abel, was a mason, and Edward was a tinsmith before he enlisted. D.C. Hammond wrote to his wife about seeing Edward Follett, and the next time they meet, he said they'll talk about home. Well, records vary about what happened to Edward after he was captured. He was either sent to Salisbury Prison or to Andersonville. Then he either escaped or he was exchanged, but he came out of the war alive, and after the war he moved to Duluth, Minnesota, where he died in 1919, and he's buried in Duluth. It's interesting, in the Penfield Extra, Little Nellie didn't write a lot about the war. She was a young girl, and I don't know, I'm sure she was interested. Her brother was in the war, but not like some of the big national newspapers where that was the headlines every day. So, but once in a while we get little articles for her that were written. Okay, she printed an article and she mentions all 3 of those soldiers from the 8th Cavalry. She had received bad information, so her article is not correct, but it is interesting. It was printed November 24th, 1864, and as follows. The headline said, "Died in hospital. We learned from a reliable source that Mr. D.C. Hammond died in the hospital last week. We also hear that 2 abolitionists were shot in cold blood after being taken prisoner for uttering their sentiments. One of them, Mr. Case, told the rebels that this war was just the thing he'd been praying for the last 20 years. The other, Mr. Follett, when he was last home on furlough, said that they got the traitors wiped out down south and they were coming back to wipe out the copperheads of the north. We trust that in leaving Abraham's kingdom, they have been accepted into Abraham's bosom." Nellie, she was just 15 when she wrote that article. Her father was a Southern sympathizer or a copperhead. They weren't happy with Mr. Lincoln as a president, which explains her reference to Abraham's kingdom. She was probably referring that to the South, and then into Abraham's bosom, she was referring to the fact that they had died. It is likely, but it's not documented, that both Case and Follett were abolitionists. We don't have documentation on the Underground Railroad or much on the abolitionists in Penfield for the very reason that there were copperheads here, and they could have been arrested or just, hassled by the neighbors, but they could have been arrested if they were aiding in the Underground Railroad even after the war ended. That's big enough to see. Next I want to talk about Jonas and Benjamin Easley. These brothers are listed in the Penfield Town Clerk's records of the Civil War soldiers. Benjamin was 28 when he enlisted as a private in Company G of the 104th New York at Rochester in August of 1862. He was 5'8" tall with a light complexion, gray eyes, and light hair. Jonas was 25, 5'6", also light complexion, gray eyes, and light hair. He also enlisted as a private in Company G of the 140th. Both were born in Switzerland. We have a lot of soldiers that were born in Switzerland and came here. And they both listed their occupation as farmer. In his recollections of the war, written in the early 1900s, Jonas wrote that the brothers tried to enlist in Captain Gray's sharpshooter company, but that group had 7 more men than they needed, so the brothers transferred to the 140th. And I need to do something. Hopefully it'll work with my computer here. Okay, this is a map. Jonas Easley writes that they were sent to Camp Porter on the Genesee River, and they were sworn in September 13th, 1862. There was a camp for recruitments there, and then there was also Camp Hillside that was kind of in the same area. Let's get rid of this thing. And Camp Porter was in the area where vacuum oil is at the time this map was printed, and you can see it's across the river from the University of Rochester. And then I'm going to move to another drawing map. And this one, the Camp Porter, is near the top of the page, where the vacuum oil was, and then University of Rochester's near the bottom, so it's a different view of that. Okay, then after they were sworn in at the camp, they were sent to Washington, D.C., and they stopped in Auburn along the way to receive their guns, cartridge boxes, haversacks, and canteens. So then they were ready to fight. They were ready to be soldiers. From there, they continued to Maryland, where they camped near South Mountain for several days. They did picket duty atop the mountain, which is quite narrow and slopes down like the roof of a house. And I'm going to get you a picture of that. His description is pretty apt. It's a little bit hard to see, but it kind of does look like the roof of a house. And so they were doing picket duty on the top of that. They were doing the picket duty shortly after the Battle of South Mountain had taken place, in which there were 2,900 casualties. Jonas writes, "The dead were buried in such shallow graves that they were not entirely covered. In one place I could see a nose and part of a face. In another, a man's toe stuck out of the ground, while in others only the clothing showed. It was hard work digging the grave here, the ground being full of roots and stones, and probably the digging was done in haste. But it was rather gruesome for a new beginner," because remember, they had just come from their training camp. Also, this is a sideline, 2 future U.S. presidents participated in that battle on South Mountain, Rutherford B. Hayes and William McKinley. So I thought that was an interesting thing that I ran across. In December of that year, they marched to Fredericksburg, and that's what you see pictured here. This is a picture from the time. Arriving on the 13th after the start of the Battle of Fredericksburg. They camped on the east side of the Rappahannock River. Jonas writes, "We marched across the river on pontoon bridges." And this is a little hard to see. I got another picture of the pontoons. Nobody's marching on them, so these are just the pontoons, and they were built for that purpose. They marched across the pontoon bridge into the city, where we halted on one of the cross streets until darkness set in. We marched out on the battlefield proper between the city and Mary's Heights, and this is the picture of the battlefields down, well, where the smoke is, and we're actually looking down from Fredericksburg where the Confederates were stationed. Firing ceased about 9 o'clock. John Kohler, who was Jonas's tent mate, looked around for a place to lie down for the night. He found a place near a board fence where he said there were some fellows sleeping. So we went there and laid down among them. Next morning we counted 28 dead soldiers around us. These were the men John thought were asleep the night before. As soon as it was light, the enemy began firing at us, so we had to lie down and hug the ground very close all day long. If we raised our heads or any parts of our bodies a little too high, we were likely to get hit. Some of us were hit. When it became dark again, we moved to a cemetery below the heights to do picket duty. We were immediately below the enemy's fort, and we could hear them talk plainly. We were withdrawn from this position before daylight. And this shows the Battle of Fredericksburg. The units are listed on here. I can't find the 140th New York, but we know from this description they were there. But all of the blue are the Union forces, and they're attacking. The Confederates, I don't know how familiar you are with the Battle of Fredericksburg, but the Confederates won this battle, and they certainly had the upper hand because they were up on the hill, and the Union soldiers just kept marching into their.
It looks like there were a lot more Union soldiers.
Yeah, it does look like it. I'm not certain of the numbers that were there, but
the Union soldiers were sent forward in brigades, one at a time. 17,000 Union soldiers were killed on that battlefield in one day.
Because it was ridiculous. They just kept marching in. And and the Confederates were up on the top of the hill firing down, and then they'd drop, and then the next one would be sent in. It was a crazy battle. You know, they didn't learn. I mean, after one or two, you'd think, but anyway. In January and February, actually, Jonas lived through that, and his brother Benjamin too. In January and February of 1863, typhoid fever ran through the camps, and many soldiers died from that disease. Jonas was sick with it. And for about 3 weeks, as he described it, all the hospitals were full, so I was not taken out of my tent. My brother found an apple crate and placed the staves on the ground and covered them with a rubber blanket, and this was my bed during my sickness. So I pulled out a picture of an apple crate to show you. It looks like it'd be real comfy. There was about 4 inches of snow on the ground at this time, and being delirious, I often walked out in my stocking feet. But he recovered. In June of 1863, the regiment was marching toward Lee's army, and he said, we followed the Blue Ridge Mountains through Pennsylvania towards Gettysburg. We passed through a very primitive country. This was a forced march, long and exhausting. We marched almost day and night. We were in rags, dirty and lousy, no time to clean up, almost barefoot, hungry and tired. Our wagon train could not keep up with us, so we had no supplies of any kind. I had no extra shirt, and the one I was wearing became so infested with body lice that I took it off and threw it away, and was without one for 3 weeks until we got back into Virginia. I wore a blouse, which I think is like an undershirt. I tried looking that up and couldn't find a description of a men's blouse. He said, but it worked up at night, and many times my bare back came in contact with the ground and it woke me up. So he had something under his shirt that he described as a blouse. And this is another picture of Jonas. On July 2nd, 1863, they reached Gettysburg, and they were ordered by General Warren to occupy Little Round Top. And on this picture, again, the Union's in blue, and you can see the 140th is right at the bend, or right at where the Union forces curve around. He says, we met the enemy face to face. We drove them down the hill into what is named the Devil's Den. We held this position all through the battle, but our losses were very heavy. Several officers, including Patrick O'Rourke, and 135 men were killed or wounded. That night, some of the 140th worked to bury the dead soldiers. That was in the area where the monument to the 140th stands today. And this is the monument to the 140th. It's at Gettysburg on the top of Little Round Top. They also built a breastwork for their protection in the next day's battle. A little harder to see. This is part of it here at the bottom middle of the picture. And then this was a picture from that time. Jonas said, I had some experience building stone walls, so the men brought the stones to me and I built the breastwork, which stands this day on the side of Little Round Top. So he must have known how to stack those stones. But it was what they used for their protection. And this is another picture from that time of the breastworks. This one's kind of hard to see. This is bodies on the field at Gettysburg. Jonas said on the 3rd day of July it rained very hard. When we laid to sleep, we were without shelter or covering. I had a rubber blanket rolled around me during the battle. When I unrolled it, I found it full of bullet holes, so that it was useless as a covering. So that's, first of all, he had the date wrong. This was remembering back from his memoirs were written in 1911. So he was remembering back a few years. It was actually July 4th when it rained, not the 3rd. But it's interesting, he has his blanket wrapped around his waist. He doesn't get wounded, but when he takes his blanket off to use it, it's full of bullet holes. So they came pretty darn close. As the army marched south to pursue Lee, Jonas remembered the following. Here we had the novel experience of seeing a man drummed out of camp. And I'm going to, this is not necessarily that man, this is just one that I could find. They'd shaved one side of his head and face and left the other side of his beard and hair long. They marched behind him behind a fife and drum corps playing the Rogues' March, which is a traditional military march when someone's being dishonored that way. And He says the Rose March is a lively tune, and they marched him behind that until they were clear of the camp. It is kind of a lively tune. But you can find on the internet there are words to that, and it had been used for other wars too. It's the poor old soldier is how the words go in it. He said we also had 5 deserters and bounty jumpers belonging to our division who were court-martialed and shot at this place. A grave was dug large enough to hold 5 coffins, and the prisoners were marched to the music of fife and muffled drum playing the Dead March, which I couldn't find. I Googled Dead March and nothing came up, so I can't play that one for you. Each man was marching behind his own coffin. These coffins were carried by soldiers on their shoulders, and then by the side of each prisoner marched a preacher of his own faith. He says 2 of the prisoners were Jews, 1 was a Catholic, and 2 were Protestants. When they arrived at the grave, the coffins were arranged along beside the grave, and each deserter was made to sit on the foot of his own coffin so that when he was shot, he would fall into it. That would sort of discourage anyone else from deserting, I would imagine. But it would probably especially bother Jonas because, not only because it was a horrible spectacle, but because it was about the same time that his brother Benjamin deserted. Benjamin was returned to the unit the following November. He was charged with desertion. He pled guilty. He had to forfeit his pay, which was a small price to pay because they weren't getting their pay anyway. And he was sentenced to 5 years hard labor. So I don't know how they decided how they were going to take care of somebody, but they were pretty tough on some of them. Jonas was wounded in the arm at the Battle of the Wilderness. As he was moving to the rear, he was wounded again in the shoulder. Benjamin came to see Jonas in the field hospital, and it was the last time the brothers met. Benjamin was taken prisoner at the Battle of Weldon Station in August of 1864, and he was sent to Salisbury Prison in North Carolina, where he died. It was reported in the newspaper locally that Jonas was mortally wounded, which his wife read before he had the chance to write to her. So imagine picking up the newspaper and reading that your husband had died. There wasn't enough room in the ambulance wagons to transport all of the wounded soldiers to the hospital, so those were able walked. They traveled by boat up the Potomac to Washington and then to the Harwood Hospital, and this is a field hospital where he initially was seen. And this is the ambulance train, but he was walking, and so were the other soldiers that could do that. And then he said at this Harwood Hospital, which is here, it's really just a series of buildings that were put up for that purpose. We stopped about 4 days, but the doctors never looked after our wounds, nor did they give us enough to eat. From Harwood, they were put in cattle cars and sent to Baltimore, then to Philadelphia, then to the Citizens Hospital. They finally received food and had their wounds tended 10 days after receiving them. Lastly, they traveled to McClellan Hospital, where Jonas stayed for 3 months. After recovering, he rejoined the unit in Petersburg, Virginia, where he helped to bury the dead and tore up the Weldon Railroad from Petersburg to Weldon, North Carolina. He said the men did tear up the road, build fires of the ties, heated the rails in the middle over these fires, then bent them around a tree or twisted them out of shape. On the last night it rained and it froze as it fell. We had no shelter, and being close to the enemy, we made no fire. We hung a rubber blanket to protect our heads and covered ourselves with another blanket and went to sleep. The next morning, the ice was 1/4 of an inch thick all over us, and when we stirred ourselves, the ice cracked off. This is a picture of a group of soldiers, local ones. Jonas is in the top right corner to you as an older man. I'm going to leave that picture up. In March of 1865, they broke up winter camp and started to march toward the rebel camp, toward the rebel army. They were surprised by Confederates and were given orders to move forward in a hurry. Jonas tried to sling his knapsack on his back, but he had no time and he had to abandon it. Rebels were firing at the back of the Union soldiers. Jonas describes, "I heard someone running behind me." Now remember, Jonas is 5'4". Okay, he heard someone running behind him, but I did not look around for fear of losing ground. But in spite of my running faster, the man kept gaining on me, and when when I saw it was Sergeant Thompson of their same company, who's a man who was 6'4", he jumped clean over me and went on. I had to stop and laugh to see him go. Thompson had been in a rebel prison before, and he didn't want another dose of that. Jonas Easley wrote an article for the School Bell Echo in West Webster schools in May of 1914. He writes of the war, and this is the group that gathered in 1914, the local soldiers. He writes of the war and concludes with, "As we marched with aged steps toward life's setting sun, there shines in our faces the glory of having achieved great things in our short lives. We have helped to give to humanity the best, the purest, the most righteous government that the world ever knew. We have helped to give to the world, as its pillar of fire, to lead it ever onward and upward, a stainless flag, which we hope will live for centuries to come, and that an unborn people will live under it in peace and plenty." And that's the end of what I have to say today. I want to invite you to get up and have some refreshments. One other thing before I end, the table that Charlie mentioned back there by Jean, I brought some papers and articles that I have in the local history room. You're free to take a look at them here or come in there and read them. There are 2 library books I have checked out currently. One's the Brian Bennett's book on the history of the 140th, and the other one is, I can't remember the title, but it's about the balloons that were used as spy balloons. Both checked out to me, but if anybody's interested, I'll return them and you can check them out today.
It's called Lincoln's Flying Spies. That is Low in the Civil War Balloon Corps.
This is very interesting. You know, you wouldn't think that they were doing that at that time.
Have you been aware at all of some recently published memoirs from the 140th by a Porter Furley, who was essentially the best friend of Patrick O'Rourke at that battle?
His, I think his papers, the originals of them, all exist at the Rochester Public Library. Maybe somebody took them and published them. I haven't seen them. And I know if you want to use the originals, you have to go downtown. You can't get those sent into this library, but I haven't seen them. So get up and help yourself to some refreshments and come back in about 5 minutes.